Recording is going around. Okay, there we go. Hi, welcome everyone. We're very pleased to be holding the Robert J. Christen Program in Early American History and Culture here in March of 2022. I'm Adam Aronson, a professor of history at Manhattan College, and I've had the pleasure of hosting the last three of these lectures. They go back to 1986 when they were founded to honor the memory of Dr. Christen, who had died in 1981, an esteemed educator and public servant. The program, Dr. Christen had begun as a Manhattan prep student when Manhattan College had a high school, and he was also an undergraduate in the School of Arts, graduating in 1952. And then he joined the faculty of Manhattan College in 1958, and having earned a master's degree and a PhD from Columbia University. He was a specialist in the colonial and revolutionary periods of U.S. history, and hence that's what our program has focused on. And he was instrumental in founding what that was at the time was called the Pacem in Terris, though I think I'm messing up the Latin, which is now the Peace and Justice Studies program. He had also was an active member of the ACLU, where he had served on the Committee for Academic Freedom. He was a member of the local school board, District 10, and he was appointed to the New York City Board of Education, and he chaired the Committee on Collective Negotiation with the Teachers Union in that period. As I had mentioned earlier, PS 81 in Riverdale is named in his honor, and we're also happy to welcome two of his children with us this evening among the people who are joining us. Our speaker this evening, I have the pleasure to introduce, and then I'll get out of the way, is Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, a senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, the Kundran Open Rank Fellow at the International Center for Jefferson Studies, and a professional lecturer at the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. She received her BA with honors in history and political science at George Washington, her master's and PhD from UC Davis, and did a postdoctoral fellowship at Southern Methodist University. She's also worked as a historian for the White House Historical Association, and her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Ms. Magazine, The Daily Beast, Time Magazine, USA Today, CNN, NBC Think, The Washington Post, and elsewhere. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, now out in paperback. And her forthcoming book is An Honest Man, The Inimitable Presidency of John Adams. So there's a CC button at the bottom if you, the closed captioning will help you. And we encourage you to put questions in the chat at any point so that you don't forget it. And Dr. Chervinsky will get to them at the end. So welcome, Dr. Chervinsky. We're very happy to have you.
Well, thank you all so much for being here and for having me. It's a real pleasure. Of course, I wish these things could be in person, but nonetheless, I'm very grateful for technology to make virtual visits possible. My goal tonight is to share with you a short and brief program about Washington, the cabinet, and the challenges to the Constitution. And then I would like to leave plenty of time for questions. That is always my favorite part because I want to know what you want to know more about. So please don't hesitate to put the questions in that chat function, and hopefully we can have a really lovely conversation at the end. Let's see here. Okay, can everyone see screens? Excellent. Thank you so much. I feel like it's always important to ask before beginning. So any conversation about the cabinet really has to start with the Constitutional Convention. A little bit of background, I started this project with the question in mind of where did the cabinet come from? The word cabinet does not exist in the Constitution, and no legislation ever created it. So I was trying to figure out, how did this body originate? And I set about, when I was originally in graduate school, looking for books that explained an answer to this question. And it turns out the last book that was published on the subject was in 1912, and it's no longer in print. So I had to spend a fair amount of time trying to dig around, trying to actually figure out where it came from. And the Constitutional Convention is a really important place to begin, because the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were very worried about a cabinet. They had blamed the British cabinet for instigating hostilities against the American colonies And keep in mind, the convention took place in 1787, just 4 years after the official end of the war. So this was a very, very recent memory. They felt that the British cabinet was really the height of corruption and cronyism in the British system. It lacked all transparency. It was hard to tell who actually was in the cabinet, who actually had power. And that was a system they very much were trying to prevent from emerging in the new executive branch. So much so that when several different delegates proposed several different types of councils, including one that looked almost identical to the cabinet that ended up emerging, the delegates explicitly voted against those proposals. So it wasn't just that they didn't think of it or that maybe it hadn't come up. They explicitly rejected any type of council written in the Constitution. And they were pretty honest in the Constitutional Convention in the discussions about why they were doing this. Here are a couple of cartoons that were printed during the war that show or depict the British cabinet corrupting the king, messing with his mind, holding him captive, so much so that at the very beginning of the war, people actually referred to the regimentals or the British troops as Parliament's troops. They distinguished between the king's forces and Parliament's forces, and they actually had flags that demonstrated as much. So these concerns were very much at the front of their mind. They discussed them. They worried about all the different types of councils and what they might do to executive authority, how they could prevent such things from happening, and ultimately decided that they were going to reject those notions. Now, it's important for us when we're thinking about how this conversation came about, how these decisions were made, that George Washington was, of course, present for all of them. He was the president of the convention. He was there every single day. He did not miss a single session. After the end of the official day's work, he would go to the theater, drink tea, enjoy dinner, go riding, listen to music, you name it, any type of social activity. He did so almost every day and usually in the company of other delegates. And while there isn't a great record about what they talked about, my guess is they were usually discussing the day's events. So when he left the Constitutional Convention in September of 1787 with the draft convention that had been sent, the draft constitution that had been sent to the states, Washington had a very clear sense of the delegates' expectations. He knew what was expected of the first president, and everyone pretty much acknowledged that if the Constitution was ratified, he was going to become the first president. So he had a very clear sense of what was expected of him. Now, that was really important because, of course, once he got into office, then he actually had to figure out what he was going to do. So the delegates to the convention had explicitly rejected these proposals, but they also understood that no one person could be expected to have all of the answers. No one person could govern without some sort of advice and support. So they came up with two options that they believed would strike the right balance between transparency and safe, responsible advisors, but not tempt too much corruption or cronyism. The first option is listed in Article 2. I'm sure it is a clause you have all heard because, of course, it is still in Article 2. And it says that the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, will make treaties and foreign appointments. Now, this clause today we understand to mean that the Senate will essentially veto or rubber stamp any policy or appointment that the president makes, usually independently of the Senate. So when a president comes up with a treaty, usually he sends the Secretary of State or representatives, they go negotiate that treaty, and then they bring it to the Senate to either say yay or nay. In 1789, when Washington took office, they had a very different understanding of this clause. They meant that advice part quite literally. Now, I'm sure you guys have all heard the warnings of, you should never say the founders thought, because if anyone says that, usually that they're telling on themselves because the founders rarely agreed about anything. And so to say the founders thought is a very precarious statement. However, in this case, there is pretty widespread agreement based on documentation and the letters and pamphlets that they offered during the ratification process that most of the delegates anticipated that the Senate would serve as a council of foreign affairs. Basically, that they could be there to answer questions, provide advice for the president, be a sounding board when tricky issues came up. And given that the Senate was only 22 people in the fall of 1789, that sounds a little bit more reasonable than trying to get advice from 100 people. Anyone who has been in a meeting with 100 people knows that that would be a terrible, terrible idea. They thought that the senators would be safe advisors, and I put that in quotes because that's literally the language they used, because the state legislatures would select them. So the states, in theory, could be trusted to pick experienced, knowledgeable, responsible men who would give good advice. And if the advice was bad, then they would remove those senators and provide new people to provide that input and those opinions for the president. So with this context in mind, Washington entered office in the presidency in April of 1789, and just a couple of months later, he set up his first official visit to the Senate. The point of the meeting was an upcoming peace commission between representatives of the Creek and Cherokee nations, North and South Carolina, and the federal government. There was a great deal of tension and conflict on the western borders, and Washington needed to provide instructions to the representatives for the federal government on what they should do, what they were supposed to be negotiating, how they were supposed to handle this upcoming summit. And he had never written instructions like that before. It was just the first of many, 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 many actions that he had to take that had no precedent and no model to follow. So he arranged for a meeting with the Senate. He set the date and time. He sent them all of the existing treaties between Native American nations and the United States. So he gave them homework to prep for this meeting. He had a meeting with a committee to discuss some of the details, like how he would be introduced, where he would sit, where John Adams would sit when he was in the room. All the sorts of things that maybe seem like they're kind of silly until you have to make all these choices for the first time and you realize just how many of these decisions actually have to be made. So all of which is to say, nothing about this meeting was a surprise. Everyone knew he was coming. Everyone knew what the subject was. Everyone had their homework assigned already. On the day of the assigned meeting, Washington brought with him the acting Secretary of War, Henry Knox, to answer any questions and provide any additional information, because Knox had overseen those previous treaties with Native American nations. Washington brought with him an address providing a summary of the issues, and then he also brought with him a list of questions. And these questions were designed to spur debate, get input from the senators, get feedback and advice, basically just kind of to get the ball rolling. John Adams actually was the one that read the address as the president of the Senate, and the senators met in silence. Some sort of fiddled their papers, some twiddled their thumbs, most of them tried to avoid eye contact. All of the strategies I'm sure the professors on this call are familiar with when students don't want to be called on. The senators were doing the exact same thing, and Washington saw through it just like teachers do as well. Eventually, William Maclay, a senator from Pennsylvania, stood up and suggested that they refer the questions to a committee because this was a new subject to them and they wanted to be able to discuss it in private. And could Washington come back the following week for their recommendation? Washington stood up. He absolutely lost his temper and he yelled, "This defeats every purpose of my being here," except much taller, much bigger, much louder, much scarier, because this was the most famous man in the world, and he was furious with them. It must have been a very, very intimidating scene. He did calm down, and he agreed to come back the following week. But on the way out, he reportedly said that he would never again return for advice. Now, the evidence about whether or not he actually said that is not great. It's a little bit sketchy, but he was definitely thinking it, because he never again returned for advice. And no president has ever returned to the Senate for advice in the way that the Constitution initially intended. So just 3 months into his presidency, one of the key elements of Article 2, one of the key ways the president was supposed to obtain advice in moments of crisis or foreign policy confusion, Washington had decided didn't actually work in practice, and he walked away from the original intent of that clause. So then he turned to the second option, which is also in Article 2, and it says that the president may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments on any subject relating to their respective offices. Now, this clause was crafted very carefully and very much with the British cabinet in mind. The British cabinet had met initially privately in a little secret room called the King's Cabinet off of the Privy Council chambers. There were no minutes taken. It wasn't always clear who was present, who had the king's ear, who was making choices. And the delegates wanted there to be a written record about who said what, who advocated which policy, and who should be held responsible in the event that something went poorly. So the in writing piece was really important. Additionally, the president may require. The president is not obligated to require, and the president is not obligated to follow the advice of the secretaries. This was a really essential element that grew off of the councils of state in the state governments when they often were designed to limit gubernatorial authority. And finally, they wanted the president talking to secretaries about the subjects that they were experts in. They didn't want people bloviating on subjects that they didn't know anything about. It makes sense that you would want the president to get advice from people who know what they're talking about. Washington fully intended to comply with this clause as well. And from the very beginning, before he even had his own appointees in office, he started exchanging written correspondence with the acting secretaries about matters that were pertaining to their portfolio. However, as we all know, when we send text messages or emails, sometimes things get lost in translation. Maybe the tone isn't always conveyed. Maybe we forget to include the attachment on a various email, or we forget to answer one of the many questions. And you can often end up with an email chain that's like 10 messages long. So imagine trying to handle these matters of state for the very first time, so that the pressure is enormous of setting precedent. And you're trying to do that with parchment and quill. You have to write it out. You have to wait for it to dry. You have to wait for it to be hand delivered by a clerk. Wait for the other person to write out their response, for it to dry, and for it to be sent back to you. And then what happens if you have follow-up questions? This is not a very precise or expedient way to go about managing the absolutely huge number of issues on the president's plate. So what Washington started doing is he would send a letter, and the secretary would send a letter back, and then would come and meet with him one-on-one at the president's house. And this way, there was a written record of what they were talking about, or a written record of the issues that had to be managed. But they could kind of talk through any edits for suggested policies. They could talk through edits to official letters to consuls or ministers abroad, and figure out any of the nuances and complications that are often handled better face-to-face. This is the president's house in Philadelphia, which is where the seat of government was from 1790 to 1800. It was the largest private residence in the city at the time. And on the second floor, there was a small room that was about 15 by 21 feet that was Washington's private study. Now, this room kind of shows what it would have looked like. Unfortunately, the building no longer exists, so I've had to recreate it. I don't think the image fully captures how absolutely stuffed with furniture this room would feel to 21st century observers. They had a very different sense of design decor than we do, and this room had multiple purposes. It was where Washington got dressed in the morning, where he received his shave from Christopher Shields, his enslaved valet, where he wrote all of his correspondence, where he met with his secretaries one-on-one. The French desk would have been actually pulled out from the wall a little bit because it had writing surfaces on both sides. There were at least 3 mahogany bookcases in the room, the globe in the corner, Washington's uncommon chair, which is still at Mount Vernon, a stove to provide heat when necessary. And then when he was meeting with the secretaries, he would have brought in, or he would have had one of his enslaved servants bring in, a table and chairs. So this room was quite stuffed. And he met with the secretaries in this space one-on-one for 2.5 years. And I just want to emphasize that 2.5 years again. The first cabinet meeting did not take place until November 26th, 1791. So Washington really tried to comply with what Article 2 said about the Constitution. Really tried to comply. He tried to first handle in writing, and then when that didn't really work, to manage the huge flow of details, he also tried to sort of find a middle ground where he would have some writing documentation, but would be able to still have the one-on-one conversation. And finally, he realized by November of 1791 that some issues are simply too huge to just talk with one advisor about. So on that first meeting on November 26th, Washington wanted to discuss with the secretaries the state of the trade, economic, and diplomatic relationships between the United States, France, Great Britain, and Spain. These are huge issues that touch on things like the Department of the Treasury for trade, of course, the Department of State for diplomacy, the Department of War if things go badly. And the Attorney General should probably be there to let you know if any of those treaties go outside the bounds of the Constitution. So just in case any of these faces are not familiar to you, from left to right, there's President George Washington, Secretary of War Henry Knox, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. So this first meeting on November 26, 1791, looked almost identical to the proposal that Charles Cotesworth Pinckney had put forth at the Constitutional Convention and had been directly voted down. And you might think, once word of this cabinet meeting and the subsequent cabinet meetings that took place afterwards became public, that there would have been an outcry. There would have been outrage by the delegates and the American people who very much objected to this replication of the British cabinet. Instead, there seems to have been silence. By 1792, everyone was pretty much talking about a cabinet. Madison would often write in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, "Did this subject come up in cabinet deliberations?" People seemed to accept, maybe because it was Washington that did it, that they could trust him to have an institution like this that was not going to be too corrupt or to destroy executive authority. And they pretty much were silent on the institution. Now, where they were not silent is if they felt that a particular secretary stepped outside the bounds of Republican, and this is little r, Republican authority. They believed very strongly that the secretaries were supposed to be subordinate to the president, and they were not supposed to have anything to do with Congress. That separation of powers part was quite important. And so when Alexander Hamilton appeared to be meddling in Congress, when he appeared to have too much authority over the legislative process, then Americans compared him to people like Lord North or Robert Walpole, who were two of the most hated British prime ministers. So they were willing to accept a certain amount of cabinet fluidity as long as it did not go too far. The cabinet went on to play a pivotal and central role in Washington's presidency over the next several years. He convened a handful of meetings in 1792, and then cabinet interactions skyrocketed in 1793 when France declared war on Great Britain and what is known as the neutrality crisis broke out in the United States. Washington and the cabinet had to figure out how to keep the new nation out of this international conflict. And even though at this point Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed about pretty much everything, they actually were in agreement that neutrality was essential. The United States was just beginning to recover from the war emotionally, financially, environmentally, physically, and they had no business getting into another conflict with the major European empires. Even if they had wanted to, the US had no navy or army, so it literally had nothing with which it could fight. So war was very much out of the question. Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, which basically said that the US was staying out of it, and European powers were welcome to supply themselves with food and essentials, but were not allowed to use American territories or American citizens as part of their war effort. But figuring out how to actually be neutral, figuring out what that means is actually much more complicated than just issuing a proclamation. For example, if an American citizen does decide to participate, what law are they breaking? What court is supposed to hear that case? Who's supposed to bring that case forward? Who is supposed to implement any sort of punishment? These were just a few of the questions on the domestic front. And the foreign policy front was much more complicated, largely thanks to the man on the right, who was the new French minister, citizen Edmond Charles Genet. Now, Genet had a very different sense of what the neutrality, what the role of the United States should be in this conflict. He believed that the US should fight on behalf of France, and if it couldn't fight physically, then it should provide all of the funds that France might need in this war. He decided to disregard all concept of the proclamation neutrality or the rules that Washington was trying to set down, and he set up shop. Do I have my pictures? No, I don't have. He set up shop in the port of Philadelphia, creating basically a factory of privateers. Now, privateers were basically private ships sailing under a license from a foreign nation to go attack that nation's enemies. It was very common standard practice in warfare in the 18th and 19th century, so there wasn't anything particularly alarming about that. What was alarming was that he was doing so quite literally 6 blocks from the president's house in Philadelphia. So needless to say, his behavior did not go unnoticed by Washington or Jefferson, nor did it go unnoticed by the British minister, who also lived in Philadelphia and would send letters to Washington basically saying, how is this neutral behavior? Ultimately, the cabinet met 51 times in 1793, up to 5 times per week, sometimes for several hours per day, and in August came up with a list of rules of neutrality that they sent to Congress, and Congress codified into law. That list of rules of neutrality actually governed periods of neutrality all the way up to the Civil War, and basically set very clear rules about things like Genet, what privateers could do, what citizens could do, and it tried to help establish foreign policy really for the first time. And the cabinet was central to that role. The next year, the cabinet carved out similar authority, this time over the domestic sphere. In July of 1794, protests over a whiskey tax boiled over and became violent when the protesters burned down the home of a local tax collector near Pittsburgh. And when Washington received reports of this violence, he gathered the cabinet and basically said, what should I do? There were 4 options. He could leave it to the states to manage, which in theory, in a Confederation period, would have been the appropriate thing. He could wait for Congress to come back in session in the fall to manage. It was a domestic issue, so in theory, Congress was the main source of authority over domestic conflicts and was the rightful person to make a choice. He could convene an emergency session of Congress to call up the military or call up the state militias to crush the rebellion. Or he could use a recently passed bill that allowed the president to call up local militias in the event of an international invasion or domestic rebellion. Any guesses about what the cabinet decided to recommend? Needless to say, based on the image, it's clear that the cabinet recommended that Washington take advantage of this recently passed bill, call up the local militias after having sent out a peace delegation to demonstrate that they had really tried all options to avoid violence. But what's amazing about this moment is really in just a matter of minutes, the cabinet decided to sideline state and congressional authority over domestic issue and carve out a sphere of authority, carve out jurisdiction for the president to take a decisive stance and use executive power to crush this rebellion. And all of that is kind of without anything in writing. So it's a pretty remarkable moment where the cabinet steps outside of the official text of the Constitution to assert executive authority. The final moment that I want to highlight for you all occurred in 1796. In 1794, Chief Justice John Jay, who is the second person from the left in the left image, Washington sent Jay to London to negotiate a new treaty with Great Britain to try and resolve some of the lingering tensions from the Revolution. Jay sent back the treaty The Senate ratified it, Washington signed it, and then it went to the House of Representatives to raise funds for a commission that would adjudicate pre-war debts. And that commission required money to pay the people sitting on it. The problem was this treaty was very, very unpopular, especially in the South and with the Democratic Republicans. And so the Democratic Republicans in the House used this opportunity to raise funds as a way to try and scuttle the treaty. They were convinced that Washington and Jay had been in cahoots to sell out Southern interests, and they figured that if they could bring forth all of the papers demonstrating those machinations behind the scenes, that it would so embarrass the Washington administration that the treaty would basically fall apart. They requested all executive papers pertaining to these discussions, and Washington convened the cabinet and asked what he should do. The cabinet encouraged him to assert executive privilege for the first time, which he did on March 30th, 1796, in a truly spectacular letter. It's one of my favorite items that I read in the archives. And Washington basically says, this is essentially a matter of national security. He didn't use those words. I'm paraphrasing. It is a matter of national security, and I have complied previously with many congressional requests for executive papers. I believe in congressional oversight. But diplomacy requires secrecy in order for other nations to trust us, to engage in future deliberations. And so we have to protect that trust and keep those conversations private. However, if this was a congressional inquiry for an impeachment, that would be a higher bar. And I would hand over the papers because I recognize the higher bar of oversight during an impeachment inquiry. He then closes the letter by saying, I was at the Constitutional Convention. I was there when we deliberated what was the role of Congress and the President and the Senate and the House in making treaties. And you are trying to seize more authority than the Constitution gives you. You are trying to usurp the role of the Senate. And if you don't believe me, I have the journals from the convention sitting in the State Department offices, and you are welcome to come look at them. It is the ultimate mic drop moment. It is so sassy, and Washington's not usually sassy, so I very much enjoy this letter. But this was a really important presidential precedent, which of course we see the value of today because executive privilege continues to be a huge part of our political life, and the cabinet was essential in helping Washington craft that. In his final days in office, Washington actually turned away from the cabinet. So after 1793, with its peak of 51 meetings, it sort of tapers off and then at the very end bottoms out. I speculate Washington didn't ever say why. So my informed speculation is that I think Washington didn't like the people that he had in office. His original dream team had retired or resigned, and the replacements, which I affectionately have dubbed the B team, I think Washington thought less of. It was really hard to get people to fill those positions. I don't think he thought as highly of their intellect, their abilities, and he certainly didn't trust them as much. As a result, he left a couple of really important precedents that have shaped how the cabinet has evolved over time. So first, the cabinet is designed to serve the president. If it makes sense for the president to meet weekly or twice a week, like Grant and Theodore Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln did with their cabinets, great. If it makes sense for the president to never meet with the cabinet and discuss things with advisors one-on-one, that's okay too. Each president is supposed to design their cabinet to serve their interests and their needs however they see fit. Additionally, each president gets to pick their own closest advisors. Now, sometimes that might be a couple of the cabinet secretaries, maybe it's people in the National Security Council, maybe it's people in the White House staff. Of course, the cabinet has expanded and evolved a great deal over the centuries. Maybe it's former business colleagues, friends, family members. Those relationships primarily take place in private, outside of congressional or public oversight, and that goes directly back to Washington's decision to have these private interactions that are not in the Senate, that are not in writing. Now, as I've depicted here, sometimes that works really great. Sometimes that flexibility presidents can take and run with. Lincoln, FDR, I would say Grant, Theodore Roosevelt, they had fantastic cabinets that really served their needs and their administrations. They had different methods of managing them, but it worked for them. Other times, that flexibility is actually really a problem. If a president can't manage the people in his, or someday hopefully her administrations, then the cabinet can really undermine an administration or run roughshod over a presidency. Madison fell prey to this problem. His cabinet completely ran over him. Harding trusted his cabinet way too much and delegated a lot of authority. And although he died before he saw a lot of the consequences of those actions, his reputation is very much tarnished by all of the scandal in his cabinet. So it really is a mixed bag. The last element that I want to highlight in terms of Washington's cabinet precedent that we often don't think about, but is a real opportunity and one that I believe the best presidents have embraced, is the role of diversity. Now, Washington's cabinet, by 21st century standards, is not particularly diverse. It's 5 white guys. But at the time, only white men were citizens, and Washington's contemporaries understood that this was a very diverse group. They had different educational backgrounds, religious backgrounds, experiential backgrounds. They represented different economic and factional interests. They came from different parts of the country. And what Washington was trying to do was to bring together the states to build sort of very tenuous emotional ties between the American people and the new federal government at a time when nationalism didn't really exist. There was no real federal symbol for people to rally around. And the cabinet was a remarkable way for Americans to feel that they were represented in the new federal government. So fast forward over the years, this concept has expanded in step with either how the nation has grown geographically or how civil rights and suffrage have expanded to include other types of people. So, for example, in Lincoln's cabinet, he was the first president to have a secretary from a state west of the Mississippi River. That was really important at a time when you were trying to hold a new nation together and a union together in the midst of a civil war. Similarly, he had former Democrats, he had former Union Southerners, he had anyone who was pro-Union was welcome in his administration. Grant had a former Confederate in his secretary. He was the first president to have a Southerner that had fought. It was actually his attorney general who went on to really enforce civil rights in the South, which was a remarkable story. And of course, until our current administration, President Obama's administration was the most diverse cabinet in terms of gender, race, religion, you name it. So it's really not just an HR choice. It's not really just an optics choice. It's actually one that leads to better governing, as studies have shown that diverse groups tend to make better choices, they avoid groupthink, and they can come up with more creative solutions to problems. So with that sort of encompassing view of the cabinet in mind, I want us to think about, and I challenge you all to think about how the cabinet turns on its head the concept of originalism in the Constitution. From the very beginning, Washington did his very best to comply with the terms in the Constitution, but not if they undermined his ability to lead, not if they undermined his ability to manage the very complex issues in front of him. And the most important thing was to try and set a good example, to set a good precedent for the people that might come after. At the very least, I think Washington saw the Constitution as a plan, and no plan meets first contact with the enemy. And that is, I think, how he saw governing. He did his best to stick to the terms, but when efficiency required some sort of evolution or creativity, he was not afraid to embrace it. And that is the answer that I usually give to people when they say, what do you think about originalism? I say Washington's career as a president flies in the face of any concept of original intent. So with that, I am very excited to take your questions to discuss the cabinet and the presidency, whatever the Constitution, whatever element or direction you would like to take.
Okay, thank you very much, first of all. I will clap on behalf of the muted. The Manhattan College tradition is to start and end with questions from students. So before we get to Dr. Horn's question, and he is a scholar of the Revolutionary France, so you won't be surprised by where his question is coming from. Hopefully one of the students on our call can ask a question. you can type it in the chat. It's the easiest way. I know we have to wait a minute while people type, but hopefully they're all furiously typing right now.
Yes, furiously typing. Would you like me to tackle Jeff's question while we wait for typing?
Let's give them another moment or two. Dr. Schweitzer
Okay.
also would like to ask a question, but he is also not a student. So we will try to have the students go first.
Good plan.
Okay, students, don't be so shy.
There's no such thing as a bad question.
This is like the continental version of waiting people out in class. We can do it from possibly different time zones and definitely different states.
Well, it's like Washington when he went to get the senator's advice and he was met with silence.
Apparently, our ability to guilt students into asking questions apparently is lessened online. Okay, I guess
the power of painful silence is lessened when you can hide behind a screen.
Okay, I guess we'll go with Dr. Horn's question.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Horn, for this question. So I love the question about other countries' practices and examples. So in terms of the French example that you mentioned that developed in March of 1791, by then, for sure, Washington was already thinking about this concept. And it is very possible that he had Frederick the Great's model in mind, because what I argue in the book is actually that the councils of war that he convened during the Revolution served as his greatest model. He had gathered together his officers and aides de camp to provide advice and support before every major strategic decision, and benefited greatly from the diversity of viewpoints and feedback that he got, and that confirmed for him the value of this sort of counsel and advice before making decisions. And of course, councils of war did not start with Washington. They came from the British Army and the Prussian Army as well. And in fact, I would argue perhaps that his council of war practice was more aligned with the continental European option than the British option, because a lot of the British officers, Cornwallis in particular, liked to state his position and then have all the other officers agree to it. So it really wasn't much of a way to get advice so much as it was a way to have a bunch of yes men around you. So I think actually through the military practices, he was more influenced by these continental forces than necessarily by their government organization.
Okay, we're honored to have Representative Raskin with us, and I think his question is up next.
Yes. Well, first of all, Congressman, thank you so much for being here. It's a huge honor, and I'm a huge fan of your book. So this is fantastic. Washington and his cabinet, the unitary theory of the executive today. So Washington and his cabinet were very much in favor of strong executive authority and worked hard to carve out jurisdiction over domestic and foreign policy for the president because they believed an energetic president was important. However, it was absolutely not without limits. He believed in the power of congressional oversight. I was talking a little bit about the first time that he asserted executive privilege and very explicitly mentioned in his letter that if it had been an impeachment inquiry, he uses that language, that he would have complied with that request. So he drew a distinction between regular inquiries and impeachment inquiries. And he believed it was really important for Congress to have authority. He just didn't think that large groups, especially when they were often on break for the majority of the summer, could act with as much agency as the president in a moment of crisis. So definitely strong executive, but not without limitations. Professor Aronson, would you like me to move to your question?
Sure. I guess, yeah, we can just sort of scroll down. And
Excellent.
Dr.
So
Schwartz is the bottom, but we can come to it when we get to it.
yeah, so John Adams, he gets kind of a bad rap for his use of the cabinet. This is going to be the subject that I'm grappling with in my next book. I think it's really important to remember that the American people at the time only had an image of Washington as president. That's all that they knew, to the point where when portraitists were trying to create a presidential portrait for John Adams, they quite literally copied and pasted Washington's presidential portrait and then just put John Adams' head on top of it. And it looks as ridiculous as you can imagine it looks. So Adams, knowing that a peaceful transition of power was something that was relatively unprecedented, and the last transition that they had all observed was the French Revolution, which was characterized by guillotines and violence and incredible anarchy, that him coming into office was a very tense moment. And the American people were very nervous, and they did not take for granted that this transition would be peaceful and that it would happen without incredible care and attention to detail. With that sort of in mind, he wanted to keep as much as he possibly could the same as Washington's administration, both because he didn't want it to appear that he was rebuking the great Washington, but also because it would provide some institutional stability and retention of institutional knowledge. So he kept Washington's secretaries, which of course turned out to be one of his worst choices because they were not loyal to the office as he anticipated, and instead were either loyal to their own agendas or loyal to Alexander Hamilton, and actively undermined his administration, probably borderline treasonous, hard to say, but nonetheless, this was not a great model for cabinet behavior. But he did replicate a lot of the same practices. So before making a controversial decision, he would convene a cabinet meeting. He included the cabinet in crafting of his annual addresses. So it is very similar in overall structure. He had never had any sort of executive experience. All of his experience had been either in Congress or had been as a diplomat. And he didn't realize how much one-on-one attention was required to cultivating the type of personal relationships that made the cabinet work like it did for Washington. Okay, let's see. We have a question from Paul here who says, if most seem to agree that when they put in writing wasn't very functional in practice, is there a reason they didn't formalize the changes in writing? That is a great question. I don't have a set answer because they didn't ever really write down why they didn't change those clauses in Article 2. And unfortunately, with the 18th century, we're limited to what they decided to put down in writing. My guess is that indeed there were a fair number of amendments in the 18th century and the early 19th, not like today where it's really, really hard to get anything amended. But the principle of it, that there should be this record of who said what and who advocated which policy, was one that was generally agreed upon. Even after he retired, Thomas Jefferson had said that technically the most constitutional way to govern was in writing and not to have a cabinet meeting. But it was fine as long as it didn't undermine the administration. He obviously didn't use that exact language, but he definitely sort of said that's type of concept. So I think the principles behind that concept were ones that most legislators and most officials agreed to, that there should be a record, there should be transparency. There was just a recognition that it didn't necessarily always work in practice. Let's see, we have a question from Kate asking that one time Washington did consult with the Senate and they told him to come back the next week for a response. Did he not only never consult thus with them again, but also did he not come back that next week? Okay, so great question. Thank you for allowing me to clarify. He did go back the following week and get their recommendation. He just never went back after that and asked for their input on any measures. So that was the last time a president went to meet with the Senate as though they were a Council of Foreign Affairs after Washington went back their following week for that recommendation. Let's see. Jamie Robbins asks, which president had the most effective cabinet, in my opinion? Oh man, don't make me choose one. That's so hard. Okay, I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna choose a couple. So Thomas Jefferson actually had a remarkably effective cabinet. He very much learned from his experience as Secretary of State, and he was very intentional about when he convened cabinet meetings. He only did so when he thought it would be productive. He had hated his fights with Alexander Hamilton, which he actually referred to as cockfights, because he wanted to convey the sort of bloody, visceral, feathers flying experience of a cockfight. And he wanted to avoid that in his presidency. So he carefully cultivated relationships with the department secretaries, only brought them together when he thought it would be useful, and as a result had very little turnover and very effective relationships with his department secretaries. A couple of other examples, of course, Lincoln had his amazing team of rivals. FDR had a really wonderful cabinet. He actually had a couple of different cabinets because he was in office for so long, but the piece of his cabinet experience that I like the most came during wartime. He replaced a couple of the secretaries in positions like the Secretary of War and Secretary of Navy with Republicans, and they agreed on no social policy. They agreed on no economic policy, but they shared values on how to fight the war, how to further the war effort. And so they could serve as a really effective bipartisan administration as long as they focused their energies in that way. So FDR showed if you're going to have a bipartisan cabinet, it can be done if you have enough of an overlap of values that it won't undermine your administration or your agenda or the war to save democracy. Let's see. Frederick asks, his former student, Ed Countryman. I know Ed. Yes, he is at SMU. He was also a student of Robert Christen. He wrote a letter. Yes, thank you. I'm so glad that you know him. He is a wonderful historian. His book is, especially the one that won the Bancroft, is an amazing resource. And he is both a student of the Revolution and an excellent teacher of the Revolution. Let's see. Julie is also commenting on Ed. Fantastic. So Congressman Rasmussen asks, what was the agenda of the cabinet meetings like? Specifically, was it to address urgent hot topics, or did they go around and allow each cabinet secretary to report? Oh, thank you for asking this. So this brings up sort of the fundamentally odd nature of the cabinet positions. Cabinet secretaries are both supposed to be managers of their bureaucracies and advisors to the president. And often, especially in the 21st century, the skills that would make one a really good advisor and one a really good manager don't necessarily overlap. That was a little bit less difficult in the 18th century when we didn't have the same sort of professionalization of industry or positions that we would expect today. But how Washington managed it was that he would meet one-on-one when it was an issue just pertaining to their department. So let's say Hamilton had a bunch of open positions he needed to fill in the Treasury Department, or he had an update on the reports of taxes collected in various ports. He would discuss that with Washington one-on-one. Usually he would have a written report, and they would also meet in Washington's private study to discuss that information. If Washington didn't know what to do, if he was going to make a controversial choice, if it was an unprecedented choice, then he would usually convene the cabinet together to get multiple perspectives, to get a lot of different information, or if he needed to build consensus and he wanted to make sure that he had the buy-in of the different secretaries. So we talked about the neutrality crisis in 1793. The reason he convened so many meetings that year was because he was trying to find a way to find a middle ground between Jefferson and Hamilton and make sure that they were, even if they didn't 100% agree with what he was doing, could at least support it. So the cabinet was very much designed for moments when the issues were so big that he couldn't answer them himself, or he couldn't answer them with one person. Jeff Horn asks, has Hamilton the musical made your task easier or harder? Do I have to unteach those memorable scenes? I love that you asked this question because it's made my job so much easier. It has introduced so many different people and new generations to this era of history and inspired them to want to learn more. And that is such an incredible gift that art can do that for history and make it fun and make it interesting. To be sure, it is art. So of course it has things that either are more dramatized or are Not exactly quite how they happened. But what I have found is that most people, if they've watched it or they've listened to it, they then say, what really happened? Or can you tell me more about this? They don't take it as fact or as a Wikipedia entry or, an encyclopedia entry. And so that's an incredible opening, an incredible gift. And I mean, as a historian and as someone who's spent so much time with this era and these documents, Lin-Manuel Miranda actually pulled a lot of information from history and a lot of language. So a great example is the song One Last Time, and it's talking about Washington's farewell address. He pulls lines from the farewell address, which is just, I mean, you wouldn't think that you could make a really amazing musical pulling from 18th century correspondence, and yet nonetheless, he makes it happen. So I will confess, the first time I saw it, I did see it live in San Francisco right after I finished my PhD, and I cried for 3 hours because I just didn't expect to see my work come to life on the stage like that. And I mean, everyone cries at the end, so you can kind of get away with it. But I looked like a crazy person at intermission because I was the only person sitting there blubbering in this show. Oh, let's see. Did I miss? So Patrick also asked about Hamilton. Was there a different question that I missed?
The question was about why had there not been a book since 1912 about the cabinet?
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much for asking that question. I think that the cabinet is such a prominent institution today, and there are such powerful positions that I think that everyone just assumed that it had already been done or that it was inevitable. And because people like Jefferson and Hamilton were in the administration from the very beginning, that the cabinet was there from the very beginning. And so people just kind of assumed that nuance and the much more organic evolution of the institution was sort of inevitable. And there are often, there are a lot of stories about some of these earlier generations that haven't been told because, frankly, the first generation of histories written about these people are almost uniformly quite terrible because they weren't really written there wasn't a standard of history and, how you're supposed to write these books. They're very fawning and hagiographic. And so the first generation of books kind of almost have to be either dismissed or treated as almost like primary sources for American memory. And then by the time we get to the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, when the concept of history as a profession and the sort of standards that we expect start to emerge more broadly, I think people assumed it had already been done. And so it just was overlooked. And so when I realized that, I then spent the next 8 years hoping no one would beat me to it.
Thanks so much. Anyone else have a question? You can, even if you can't type the whole thing, you can just quickly put something in the chat. But otherwise, I think soon we'll be able to conclude with all kinds of new ideas about Washington and his cabinet.
Excellent question about balance from Congressman Raskin. So Washington saw the same thing. Washington set that precedent. Now, of course, only white men were citizens at the time. So who could be considered for these positions was this much smaller candidate pool. But he wanted people that had different experiences and different knowledge from his own. He wanted people that came from different parts of the country and had different religions and educations, who thought about trade and foreign policy and domestic policy differently than he did. And he was a remarkable leader because he knew about his own limitations, and he sought out people who could supplement that knowledge and was not afraid to ask for their help. So, for example, Washington left the country once. He went to Barbados as a teenager. He had never been to Europe. He had never been to Versailles or the Court of St. James or any of the great diplomatic centers. And he didn't speak French, which was the language of diplomacy, which is kind of an essential way to understand the documents that are coming in from foreign nations. So Jefferson was essential because he had been to those places. He could report with firsthand knowledge how people worked in European cities, and he could, of course, read the documents. Similarly, Alexander Hamilton had brilliant financial ideas, and while Washington understood them, he didn't necessarily have that sort of creative spirit in the same way. And so that concept of pulling together all ways that it means, ways that you can be an American. Now, of course, again, white American, white male American, but they presented very different types of an American identity. And Washington wanted all of those in his administration because he knew, A, it made his administration better and it made him better as a leader. But it also allowed those types of Americans to feel that they were represented, to feel that they had a voice in the administration. And I think the best presidents that we have had have replicated that approach, recognizing that, they can't know what it's like to, walk all of the different ways of an American life. But if they can bring people around them that do, they can better represent the incredible breadth and depth and diversity of our nation, which is one of our strengths and something that the great presidents have sought to replicate Washington's approach in that way.
Okay, thank you very much. Our Dean, Corey Blatt, has also added his appreciation there. We'll clap again. But yes,
thank you very much.
Of the history department and political science and peace studies and the whole School of Arts at Manhattan College, we're very happy to have been able to host you in this event. And thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I so appreciate it and appreciate your thoughtful questions. It was a real delight. Thank you for being interested in history. I think it's more important now than ever. So this was a real pleasure.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.